So we've had a lot of provocation and challenge there from Jean-Pierre and Madeleine. Let's have your thoughts from our speakers here. So we have José Giorgos, who's the Science Europe Governing Board. We have Leslie Wilson, who is Secretary General of the European University Associations, and welcome back to Antonio. So let's start with you, Joseph, with your thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I'd like to express our sincere thanks to ALLEA for the invitation and to have an opportunity to speak on behalf of Science Europe Governing Board. And of course, thank you both keynote speakers for a really inspiring speech. And at the beginning, I'd like to introduce just a little bit Science Europe. As far maybe you already know this institution, it's an association of European research funding and research performing organization based in Brussels, fully funded by its members, member organizations, and it was established in 2011. At present, Science Europe has 36 member organizations from 27 countries with a combined research budget approximately of 18 billion euro annually, of course, all together by our member countries. And the mission of Science Europe is strengthening the era, not just with networking of members and direct engagement with the partners, but also by giving reflections on European and national policies, strategies, and priorities. So we have also working groups, and at these working group levels often, but not only, topics like research evaluation, funding instrument, impact of research, these are addressed. Specific attention is given to the cooperation between member organizations in the form of lead agency and the multilateral lead agency instruments, which is about to be launched quite soon, and having to stress the coordinating role of Swiss colleagues from SNSF, which is very important. In Science Europe, we are highly engaged in open access initiatives too. In the form of Coalition S to Plan S, we do have a demanding task of making the open access true in a, let me say, wide landscape of high-level goals, transformative agreements with publishers, and the simple fact that we, the founders, cannot stop for a moment and think it over. And that is the place where the associations like Science Europe and ALLEA play their role of think tanks, both from the perspective of funders and researchers. In the context of today's discussion, let me have a more or less personal observation on how the ever faster digitalization of nearly all aspects of modern life, like it is said in the booklet, is profoundly influencing the interaction of science and society. Having my professional background in computer science and informatics and being one of those in a generation of enthusiasts with Internet and World Wide Web more than 30 years ago, I'm often questioning about the societal consequences, the responsibility and impact of these technologies as they are used today. Let me just quote Sir Berners-Lee, the inventor of World Wide Web, who is very popular now in media also by the anniversary, and he said, if we give up on building a better web now, then the web will not have failed us, we will have failed the web, end of quote. I think it was published in Guardian in March. It leads us also to the subtopics announced in this session on rethinking disciplinary silos in science. In many ways it is happening in terms of inter- and transdisciplinarity, as well as in cooperation between the sectors of science and business, and by breaking the conventional TRL approach. Let me finish this discussion with the observation that scientists need fully embrace their additional role in the present-day Europe. They speak in the name of verifiable facts, and their contribution to public debates is vital, especially in this data-flooded world where context can easily collapse. And at the end, speaking as a Science Europe Governing Board member, let me mention that next week, the General Assembly of Science Europe is taking place, having on the agenda also the priorities for the next midterm period. And I believe that we are going to be inspired also by the ideas heard in these days at the ALLEA's 25th anniversary event. Thank you.
Leslie.
Right, good morning, everybody. So we go from one organization to another organization, the European University Association, which, as its title says, actually we have universities from 48 countries, so it goes a long way round, and they're all very different. And in several of the elements of the speeches that we have just heard, I could see a lot of issues that we have been taking up in our universities. And I think there's one word hasn't yet been said, and that's the question, a student. What is the role of the students in this context? And as I was very interested to hear that, that scientists are one of the most respected people in society. This is great, and this is, it's a contradiction a bit, as well as we said before, the questions about populism, and I think what we quite feel very important is very important for EUA is the fact that we should be starting to listen to the young students. We should be starting to perhaps do more with young researchers to make sure that we can take forward these important issues, and to try and even in those universities where there have been issues around the questions of populism inside the universities, to try and take it forward. We do this, I think we have seen over the last several years that more and more, it used to be that science was the main area in which EUA worked. So of course, but it's also universities, students, teachers, and science. But now there has been a strong move to improve teaching and learning, and to improve teaching and learning around the whole of Europe. Because we need these young people, we need them to be properly educated. We talked about, I think it was Monsieur Bourguignon said very clearly, quality education is what we should be able to start with. And I think that's why, for the moment, many of these issues that you've talked about, we have been trying to do this by improving the teaching and learning. Not to forget, of course, the open science area, which is very important for EUA as well. And many of you, I think, are aware that we have quite an important event next week in Brussels on that topic. I'll leave it for that for the moment, I think.
Thank you. Antonio, do you have anything to add?
Well, what do you mean to add? I didn't say anything so far. I just agreed to add. So not to what I said now, of course. I think that, I didn't expect when we invited our two keynote speakers to have such a cohesive representation, because the two statements, the two lectures, while starting from very different points of view, actually turned out to be animated by the same spirit. And so, I'll focus on some of the things that were mentioned in the two keynotes that I find particularly relevant and complement them a little bit. The first one, what Professor Bourguignon said about this interesting dichotomy between the persistence and the durability of confidence in science as presented in society, as compared to the somewhat to the loss of trust in scientists or in experts. So we have here a dichotomy, as it were, between science on the one hand and the use of science, or the presentation of science, or the transmission of science, which belongs rather to the level of communication, and let's call it generally to the political level. So in this respect, I very much agree with the fact that when we hear, and we hear it so much in our contemporary debate on the role of universities, for example, in society. When we hear it's so important to have an impact of science on society, well, this is a typical example of a well-meaning but somewhat confusing statement, because it's so what is missing in a statement like that is the mediate and not immediate character of the collaboration or the interchange and the absolutely necessary interface between science and society. That is, we are not talking here about confusing roles, but we are talking about strengthening a social contract between a professional expertise of scientists and a level of trust or faith in this type of conveyors of the message, not only of the contents of the message itself in society. So, and upholding a social contract is, in fact, what makes countries like Sweden different from countries like Venezuela. It's not the quality of the science itself there, but it's the quality of the social contract that guarantees the dialogue. The second point is another pair of words which we hear all the time that are wonderful words but somewhat confusing, are the pair of words excellence and innovation. And excellence and innovation are a little bit like culture. You know, culture is, of course, I make out of culture a profession, so I must love the word culture. However, precisely like innovation, excellence, these are words that can be interpreted in a static or in a processual way. And if they are interpreted, as I put it, only in a static way, that's when they lose attractivity. And so the important dimension is maintaining also the transformative power of science and upholding this type of science. And here is what is my last point, is what Madeleine said about the cross-disciplinarity. And the example of Assyriology is a wonderful example, the example of the University of Mosul. Who would have thought that a remote field of the Bronze Age, like Assyriology, would play such an important role? However, coming from a field, let's say, in remoteness comparable to Assyriology, which is Egyptology, I can tell you that there is also a pressure that we as practitioners of these remote humanities must feel, which is of truly understanding what this transdisciplinarity means. And it does not mean that the Egyptologists dialogues with the Assyriologists, which is how cross-disciplinarity has been traditionally intended in the humanities and social sciences. But that, for example, the Assyriology, dialogues with material studies, precisely for the renovation of Mosul, or with science diplomacy, with other disciplines that are not simply similar because it's easier to talk with someone who also does the same age. So in this sense, I think that the Anastasia moment, very nice description, is in fact the power that science must maintain to predict, the power of predictions, to predict possible trends within societies, and of developing a trust in society that these predictions need to be taken seriously. And that's where the dialogue works.
Thank you. So the public perhaps see science as really squabbling often. If they see headlines, it's, you know, coffee is good for you one day and not good for you the next day. They take their own meanings, and there's a danger always, I suppose, of a de haut en bas approach, that somehow scientists know better. And how are we to communicate with those people who are perhaps not interested in science? In other words, we would all like to talk to people, just like Egyptologists talking to Assyriologists, who are like them, who understand their world. So we want to talk to the public that already understand and are disposed to science. But that is actually not the area of public that we need to be working with. And it's gone, I think, from talking to the public to doing with the public. And I wonder whether, Jean-Pierre, you had any thoughts about that, because you made the point very strongly that actually perhaps we haven't solved the problems that people most want us to solve. And maybe that means that we need to go out and listen to what people think they need to be solved, have solved in their lives.
Thank you for challenging me on this. Maybe two aspects of things which I didn't bring in my speech, but I think which are related, I think, to what you said. If you take the situation for the anti-vaccine movement, for example, which I think, as you know, is now really taking a very serious toll on the security in a number of countries, including very developed countries like mine. Actually, the whole point is very much related to what is the perception that people get from the media. Of course, if you get somebody who claims that his daughter or her daughter was killed by a vaccination, and even if it's not proved, but the person is so convinced and therefore can claim, and that's such a personal disaster. So if you're confronted with somebody who says that, and that you have to compare to what it takes to make a vaccination efficient, which means that a large percentage of population accept to be vaccinated. The case of measles is very well known. It's a very contagious illness. Therefore, the threshold which makes a difference in terms of protection is very, very high. So it means just a small number of people who don't accept this immediately threaten all the other ones. And of course, they don't mean to do that, but actually they do it. So if you, in order for having people understand that their freedom is limited by the impingement on the freedom of others, this is a much more complicated process, because you have to explain how vaccination functions, why for different illnesses there are different thresholds, and all this. And also this is totally abstract, because you feel that by accepting a constraint which comes from the state, then actually you are contributing to the safety of everybody, but in a way which is completely abstract, because in the end what it provokes in the US in the early part of the year 2000, that the illness had disappeared. But in a sense, the disappearance is not something like somebody who can tell you, you killed my son or you killed my daughter. So I think this balance, and in particular, this leads me to my second point, which is today, the media, the image is so much dominating on the text. So text has to be short, and therefore if it's short, it's simplistic. And, but an image has an immediate global impact. And therefore, I think we have to be very, very careful that maybe the change we see is something which is just the beginning of, in a sense, a major impact on how people perceive things, where if you don't have an image, then actually you are not contributing, in a sense. And if you want to contribute through a text, and a text which is really substantial, which really balances various arguments and so on, it has to be long enough. Therefore, you have to take the time to produce it, take the time to read it, take the time to understand it, maybe look for extra information. And all this is very contradictory to the way we function. We function with immediate feelings, with a lot of images, which of course impress you because they are global, and even if you learn a little bit to analyze images, it's a very subtle subject. So I think we have to be very careful that maybe what we are seeing is something which actually is built into the way the social media are organized today. And it looks innocent that you replace text by images, but I don't think it's innocent at all, because the way our brain functions with images is completely different from the way our brain functions with the text. So I think we have to be careful that what we see could actually be just the beginning of very, very massive change in even the way we perceive the world, the way we talk about the world, the way we interfere with the world, interact with the world. And I don't think there is much study which has been put into this. That was part of my plea for having a more in-depth analysis of the situation, which I think for the moment, maybe I'm not reading the right authors, but is really missing.
Mm. So, Joseph, what we see is a narrative of scientists saying that the public must be educated, they must learn how we do things. And yet the counter-narrative is that really science needs to adapt itself in order to actually work in the way that social media is now working. I mean, obviously there's a balance to be struck, but where are you, particularly as a computer scientist, on this?
So I'm confused a little bit in these times. In the last 5 years, when I look at the impact of social media and what it become, but maybe I'm just growing old. So, but of course, the influence is from both sides, as you mentioned. It is needed that we communicate science in a different way. And the biggest question is maybe how to make the audience to listen to it. And Professor Bourguignon gave a very good analysis of text versus images. I think it is those from social sciences and humanities would know Baudelaire's thesis on implosion of meaning. I think that that's what we are talking about, but in a totally new dimension than it was in his time. So that there is no simple solution to this question. I think that we need to be patient, because with the flooding, in this case of information, it is the fight is very, very tough, and I think that is a bit like there are some similarities with water. Maybe that first you have to wait a little bit that it goes away, and then deal with the consequences. It's not easy, but of course important for science.
I want to bring the audience into the conversation too. So if you have a thought that you'd like to contribute, do please put up your hand and I'll come to you. Madeleine, what are your thoughts about this? And I was thinking, as you were talking about images, how easy it is to misinterpret images. And you've demonstrated it. I made a film many, many years ago about a mouse with a human ear on its back. It became an iconic image that went all around the world. It was actually a film about regenerative medicine. Today, it's used as an example of Franken-science.
I think this is a good example how important critical handling of this asymmetry is developing between information and knowledge is. And I think this is really a major point. However, this is exactly the field where the social sciences and humanities are working. This is what we develop as a methodology to handle critically information. And I think that's one of the reasons why I insist that we need a transdisciplinary vision. So the separation of social sciences on one hand and the rest of the more important scientific world in life sciences on the other doesn't work, just because we have this problem to struggle with, namely this indifference between knowledge and information. And you mentioned that we need to talk to the public. You mentioned that we need to make surveys about the question, what is going wrong? Of course, this is very important. On the other hand, what I miss a little bit is a proactive vision, is some sort of an offer that is coming from the side of science. And I think what we also need as an information for developing this kind of vision is what you also mentioned at the very end of your presentation, namely, what's about freedom of research? I would like to see a global survey how the freedom of research is developing. And I would also investigate a little bit more that whole question of the freedom of research is falling apart when it comes to the difference between the social sciences and the humanities. The social sciences and the humanities are, unfortunately, becoming some sort of an indicator for the suppression of research in authoritative regimes. And what we need is this kind of investigation because this is the first step to do what I would describe as a vision, namely to make stable scientific research on the basis of a transdisciplinary approach. And I mean really transdisciplinary, as shown, and I remember I was a young scholar when I went to the first ETH organized conference on transdisciplinarity. And that was thrilling, because that was the breaking ground for environmental history and environmental sciences, where all these kind of disciplines came together, and we had to somehow struggle with the inclusion of the stakeholders. And we are not that far that we know, for example, how to include science, public science, how to include citizen science research. This is a challenge, but again, we need a vision, and I say this as a historian: forget about the past. We need the future.
Thank you very much. That's a very important plea, and it seems to me that we, the life sciences, physical sciences, need to embrace the social sciences and historians in a way that makes it clear that actually you are all part of us to the public, which then perhaps prevents social sciences being picked off, particularly in countries where there are authoritarian regimes, which I see as an increasing problem. There's an expression is no discussion about us without us, no discussion about science without social sciences and the humanities. Thoughts from the audience? There are two of you there.
Tarmo Soomere, Estonian Academy of Sciences. Returning to the question of different fake things and anti-vaccination, it is a problem to convince people that vaccines are not good. Anti-vaccination campaign is Estonia not as strong as in France. But our scientists decided to take a slightly different approach, understanding that you can't fight a meme. You have to produce some other shocking truth. And our experts in genetics have produced a really shocking truth. It turns out that for 99.8% of Estonian population, the doctors need to adjust the daily intake of everyday drugs. So 99.8% of people are unique. If this kind of truth comes into society, it is shocking. Everybody is unique. It doesn't comfort those parents whose children who believe that their children have died from vaccines, but it does help to fight with fake things by widely spreading information about how unique and how different are different people.
I mean, thank you very much. Is one of the issues here is that science is rather reluctant to get into the Twitter bear pit. I mean, I'm sorry, I'm in Bern. I shouldn't talk about bear pits in Bern. But there is a real issue. Twitter is a vicious and horrible place, as indeed is some of the Facebook, the trolling, the deeply unpleasant nature. And it's no wonder that scientists want to retreat, because it's not arguments about reason. It's just shouting. So therefore, we don't engage, and you create an information vacuum. So do Antonio scientists need to be bolder and be prepared to go out there and actually have a lot of trouble?
I tried to refer before to this, to the flexibility in our understanding of the word culture, and now I'm going to use this word culture. Because what I would like to stress as an answer to your question is that, in fact, we are now in a new culture, in a new quote-unquote age, not in terms of science, but in terms of the communication of science than we were before. Let's call it, we have lived until a few years ago, until now, in what we might call the age of the book. Right? So the age that began with the book print. This was a major, major revolution, probably the last revolution before the current digital one. It changed everything, including theology, not just life science, including because the Reformation wouldn't have been possible without books, the Bible as a book. So everything changed through this major technological change. It was far more than a technological, it was a societal change. That's precisely what is happening now. We are not in the age of the book now, we are in the age of the internet, which means that while science has its own development, the mediality, the communication of scientific results or context needs to change. And science, and this is the issue right now. Right now, all sciences or disciplines per se are very much aware of the undergoing change and are undergoing a process of digitalization. But what has not yet changed are the processes of transmitting science. So science communication in the general sense hasn't yet reached the level. And fake news or this dichotomy we were talking before is precisely the result of it. So let's say we moved from an age in which the center of attention was the word to an age where the center of attention is the picture, all right? The iconic age. And that breaks one of the fundamental, in terms of transdisciplinarity, one of the fundamental ideas of the age of the book was this thing with the two cultures, so we have the humanities and social cultures, the sciences and life sciences. This separation makes no sense in the age of the internet. So because what unites this transmission of science is far more relevant than what separates the methods of investigating each content, each object of research. In this respect, I think that science communication needs to become aware that science itself is changing, yeah, and at the interface between changing science. By the way, Madeleine, you were asking about. So it would be interesting to see how how this revolution is transforming research itself. There's an excellence cluster at the University of Tübingen now, led by informaticians, that is precisely interested in the transformation of culture, of disciplinary culture. And I think that what we have now is precisely the need to develop a form of communication, adapt of our scientific results that takes into account this technological and not any longer technological but cultural social change.
And in some cases that's critically important, because if we want to use people's data in very large ways, then we need to be constantly transmitting back to the people who have contributed their data the outcomes of that and the research and the value that has been obtained for them from the use and for their families and their neighbours and their populations from the use of that data. And if we don't use digital methods of communication, we're sunk. We won't be able to do that. But Madeleine, you had a thought about going out to fight the fight in the Twitter sphere.
As a private person, of course, I can discuss during hours whether or not we should use all this social media. All the more that takes really, really time. And sometimes I think it's better to do research than communicating. But this is my private opinion. As a scholar, what I need is a stable methodological and theoretical framework to analyze what is going on. There are interesting works done already about, for example, the Arabic Spring, where Twitter messages are very, very important. And of course, to me as a historian, it's very important also to know how we preserve this kind of Twitter messages. What is the archive? How can I reproduce this kind of messages? But again, as a scholar, I would say we need this transdisciplinary framework, because that is a transdisciplinary approach we need to do for handling the problem. And it's much better to do it in a scientific way than at least in this case, than doing the huge political debate whether or not these Twitter messages are so important or less important. I need, first of all, the scientific approach. And just what Antonio mentioned about the revolutionary development which is going on, just take literacy. Of course, this is also an expression of Eurocentrism. We believe in literacy. This is the starting point of all academic thinking. However, today, with the cellular phones, there are social investigations about, for example, the poorest part of Mumbai, and people are illiterate, but they communicate with cellular phones. And therefore, this is the starting point of a new form of social coherence. This is also perhaps a starting point for doing research in a less Eurocentric way. So it's an opportunity to go, but again, there is a transdisciplinary solution. It's the only one what I can see, and we need to go forward.
Back to Egyptology and the use of images. We had one more question, and let me take the one first up there. There's that lady there.
So thank you very much. Tanya Jenkins from the Swiss Academy of Sciences. We've spoken a lot about talking with the public, and yesterday we heard an amazing plenary talk by Professor Mazzucato about how to reshape science and science communication in Horizons Europe. And a large part of that is the principle of co-creation. So rather than talking to the public, and I think that's what you were trying to also say, Vivian.
Yes.
The principle of how do we actually engage with the public.
And allow them to direct the research agenda even.
Exactly.
Which is a horrifying thought for many people.
And particularly very scary for everyone. And we're talking about trying to change social contracts. How do our panelists feel about citizens and civil society directly being there to engage and shape this process?
Okay, let me go to Leslie first of all. Panel, can I ask you all to be brief? Because I want to get a couple other questions in.
Well, to answer this question, we've already tried it out in some of our events, and it's been very, very successful, and we hope to carry on and to do more in this area.
And are you, though, discussing with people who are already inclined to be involved, or are you going out to people who are not inclined to be involved?
I think what we're trying to do is to do both. But of course, it's easier to go and speak to your peers rather than others. But I think we've got a lot of advice in this for our association, and so we really are trying to make it work.
Thank you. Let's take another question.
I'm Luke Drury from the Royal Irish Academy. I was very struck by the phrase Madeleine used at the end of her presentation, that the tension between knowledge and understanding is dangerous. And it seems to me that this goes to the heart of really what we're talking about. I mean, are the universities teaching facts or methods of understanding, methods of analysis? Are the academies actually promoting a civic engagement with what knowledge is? And I served on the ALLEA working group on trust, truth, and expertise, and Baroness Honora O'Neill made a very interesting point that we should focus more on trustworthiness than trust. And part of the problem is that in this new digital age, there are no reliable badges of trustworthiness attached to communication. And is there some way we can address that, maybe through the academies, through the research funders? Can we somehow make clear what is trustworthy and what is just speculation? That's a challenge, I think, to all of us.
I fear we have less time to discuss that. We possibly need a whole day to discuss that. So, Madeleine, just let's come very briefly to you, if you would.
Yes, this is a discussion we should continue during hours. It's really a big question. I would say I teach methods, not topics. And the question of which kind of information we should trust is exactly embedded in my methods. This is why I'm talking about methods and not that much about topics. I had topics 10 years before. I would answer this question completely differently, saying that I'm going for the topics. Now I'm just more in the methods. But just, this is also related to the question to what extent we should do citizen science, of course, because you can also build this trustfulness via inclusion of the citizens as well. However, I have just to say, first of all, for the social sciences and humanities, citizen science is extremely expensive. Because we have an opportunity to gain much more information, and this is good because in social sciences and humanities we cannot pay to collect big data. We need this citizen science, of course. But on the other hand, we have to deliver stable results, meaning that we have to test twice at least, what we have gained from the public set. And this is kind of also difficult so we have some sort of a turn within the sciences, which is pretty much related on the financing of the sciences. And this is another point where I think we should share this transdisciplinary approach also with regard to the financial support.
So Madeleine, ending with a very well-timed, it wasn't worked out like that, financial plea there for more money for social sciences and citizen research. Interestingly, we have a Strength in Places fund, which has been set up by UKRI, and I'm on the board of UKRI, and responsible particularly for public engagement. And we have baked in public engagement because that's intended to bring science to areas that are not usually supported. And therefore, it's very important to involve the citizens in that area, to show them that science is doing stuff for them and with them. Okay, thank you very much, our panel. We could have gone on for much longer, and I'm really sorry we've had to stop. But thank you very much indeed.